B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Monday, July 16th, 2018. On these shores, people are hyperventilating, using the word treason to describe what they saw in the news conference that followed the summit meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. And yes, Trump is deeply embarrassing. I mean, when this guy goes abroad and in front of the whole world, he picks on CNN and says, "You're fake news, I won't call on you." And of course, he embarrassed us in his brief meeting with the Queen. He stunk up the summit of NATO. He infuriated European leaders. And then he went and kissed up to Vladimir Putin. Now, I do understand how deeply offensive his behavior is, and some of it is flatly misguided. But I don't believe it's treason. I looked up the definition here. Treason is the offense of acting to overthrow one's government, or to harm or kill its sovereign. And under the U.S. Code 18, whoever owing allegiance to the United States levies war against them or adheres to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort within the United States or elsewhere, is guilty of treason, and shall suffer death or shall be imprisoned for not less than 5 years and fined under this title. Now again, I think that Trump's behavior is problematic. And I have acknowledged on Friday the 13th the new dozen indictments issued by Robert Mueller, while they are not evidence, they do advance the narrative in significant ways. They add new details, and they allude to evidence that appears to exist. But if you look at it skeptically, the timing of this, not coincidental. That just 3 days before this meeting, Mueller's indictments allow the U.S. media to frame Donald Trump as a guy who's on the run from the law, in denial of the conspiracy to elect him in 2016. And of course, there was a conspiracy. We're just trying to find out who the actual conspirators were. And so, asked whether he believes his own intelligence agencies or Putin, who denies Russia interfered in the 2016 election, Trump refused to say. But he expressed doubt about whether Russia was to blame. He noted that Dan Coats, his director of national intelligence, say they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I don't see any reason why it would be. Well, I can see reasons why it would be. That doesn't mean it occurred. But when asked directly about whom he believes, Trump changed the subject to misconduct by Democrats during the campaign. And Putin had this to say: President Trump mentioned the so-called interference of Russia in the American elections. I had to reiterate things I said several times, that the Russian state has never interfered and is not going to interfere in internal American affairs, including the election process. Now, Putin is a professional liar. Trump is an amateur who's compulsive about his lying. And even Putin said that we shouldn't trust either one of them. So this is a grotesque comedy playing out on the world stage. And Putin had a little card up his sleeve. He offered to have Russian intelligence agencies work with their American counterparts to get to the bottom of all this. And Trump said that Putin had an interesting idea. And Putin, when pressed, said, well, if Bob Mueller wants to send investigators to Moscow, he made it appear that Mueller couldn't directly question the GRU members who've been indicted by name by Mueller, but that he could listen to people asking them questions. It was kind of like that. But the kicker on it is that he wants reciprocation. And he explicitly mentioned Bill Browder who is the billionaire businessman whose interests in Russia went sideways. His accountant, Magnitsky, was locked up and apparently brutalized before he was killed. Then the U.S. passes the Magnitsky Act at Browder's behest. And that's what was on the table with the Russian female lawyer, what's her name, Natalia Veselnitskaya, at the meeting at Trump Tower in June of 2016. And so Putin has very specific issues that he would like to air out with the assistance of U.S. persons. And, of course, it's a deal breaker. The deep state here in the United States would never agree to terms of that sort, even if Trump tries to force the issue. That's my opinion. And, of course, Trump goes into these, incredible digressions that just make you cringe. When asked if he held Russia at all responsible for conflict with the United States, oh, yes, I do. I do hold both countries responsible. I think the United States has been foolish. I think we've all been foolish. Now, I'm not one of those people who says that an American president can't explain, acknowledge, or apologize for American misdeeds when he travels abroad. Many people think that in itself is treasonous. And I simply do not agree with that. And so the media wanted, some of them wanted Trump to come home by forcing extradition of the 12 named GRU officers. And that's just a sick joke. We don't have any extradition treaty with Russia, and Ed Snowden is really glad about that. So without being asked, Trump said there's no collusion, blah, blah, blah. And Putin noted that they do have differences. The posture of Trump on Crimea is well known. He stands firmly by it. He continues to maintain that it was illegal to annex it. Our viewpoint is different. And Putin made a point of noting that the two leaders still disagree strongly on the Iran nuclear deal, which Trump withdrew from in May, and which the Russian president has hailed as a great success. So there's no indication that anything dramatic occurred. Maybe there are some surprises that will be sprung on us in the next few days. Speculation by the reporters of the New York Times. It was not clear whether the presidents discussed another area of conflict. The British government's assertion that a nerve agent poisoning of a former Russian spy was carried out by the GRU. We'll get to that story in a couple of minutes here on the podcast. So it's really, at this point, a vanity moment for Trump, who can say that he went mano a mano with the only other superpower of the world. And I expect that he'll come up with some bizarre claims that he and Putin settled everything, and that life as we know it may now continue. But here stateside, we have Ari Fleischer, the former White House press secretary under George W. Bush. He calls Trump's actions naive. John Brennan, the former CIA director under Obama and one of the principal architects of the Russiagate narrative, in my belief, called it treasonous. Justin Amash, the Republican representative from Michigan, who I agree with on some Fourth Amendment issues, said that it was not right. And let's see if I have somewhere here, I have a tweet from Lindsey Graham, who was critical of his President Trump. I'll see if I can find that for you. So coming back to this idea of Russia and the United States joining forces to find out who rigged our election in 2016, I have to ask if Chris Kobach would be named as a prime suspect for the Russians to investigate. As you know, I believe that domestic actors linked to the Republican Party had much more of an effect in rigging the 2016 election in favor of Trump than any outside actors might have. But Putin is quite well versed in the case of Bill Browder. So he talked about how Mueller could come to Russia, interview the 12 intelligence officers, and then we would expect that the Americans would reciprocate And they would question officials, including the officers of law enforcement and intelligence services of the United States, who we believe have something to do with illegal actions on the territory of Russia. Did he have an example, he was asked? Oh, yes, Bill Browder. Business associates of Browder have earned over $1.5 billion in Russia. They've never paid any taxes, neither in Russia or the United States, and yet the money escaped the country. They were transferred to the United States. They sent a huge amount of money, and this is an assertion nobody can say is established or true. They sent $400 million as a contribution to the campaign of Hillary Clinton. Well, that is a very specific claim, and there is no indication that Browder gave any money to the Clinton campaign or to the Clinton Foundation. And I hope some people will dig into that and make sure that that is the case. But it does show a nexus, and the Washington Post was quick to claim that since Putin referred to that, the meeting at Trump Tower with Veselnitskaya, which was about adoptions which had been curtailed because of the Magnitsky Act, that this shows that Putin knew about the meeting at Trump Tower and all the things behind it. And I'm sorry, that is a claim that cannot be proven with what we know today. Putin was also asked about claims that he holds compromising material on Trump. He quipped, "I was an intelligence officer, and I know how dossiers are made up." Then he went on, "I did hear these rumors. When Trump visited Moscow back then, I didn't even know he was in Moscow. Nobody informed me he was in Moscow. Please disregard these issues." And Trump hastily added that, if they had it, they would have used it by now. Putin also said that he did want Trump to win in 2016, quote, because he talked about normalizing relations between Russia and the United States. But when pressed on whether Russian government had compromising info on Trump or family members, he said it's hard to imagine greater nonsense. Please throw this junk out of your head. And let's see, here is the tweet from Lindsey Graham. I knew it's in my stack here somewhere. Missed opportunity by President Trump to firmly hold Russia accountable for 2016 meddling and deliver a strong warning regarding future elections. This answer by Trump will be seen by Russia as a sign of weakness and create far more problems than it solves. So we'll see over the next few days if anything significant comes out of this. But as I said, I mainly believe this is a vanity moment for Trump. It was his way of dissing all the people he met with in Europe before he met with Putin. Oh, and you may have heard that Putin presented him with one of the soccer balls from the World Cup. Trump tossed it to Melania, said, "We'll give this to Barron." And I can't remember who it was, but somebody said, "Well, let's check that for listening devices first." Joe Laria, now the editor-in-chief at Consortium News, he replaced the late Robert Parry, continues on Parry's skeptical streak about Russiagate. And I've linked to Joe Laria's analysis of the Friday indictments in the show file for today's podcast. He notes that the lack of evidence that the Trump campaign was colluding with Russia has never stopped Democrats and their media outlets from believing unnamed U.S. intelligence sources for 2 years about such collusion. This indictment, excluding collusion, also undermines the so-called Steele dossier, a work of Oppo research paid for by the DNC and Clinton campaign, masquerading as an intelligence document because it was compiled by a former MI6 agent. The memos falsely claimed it turns out that Trump's people started colluding with Russia years before he became a candidate. So there's a lot here in Laria's analysis, and I encourage you to read it. He notes that the efforts to get Trump to cancel the summit was highly political and that the timing of the announcement clearly intended to embarrass Trump as he was meeting with the Queen and heading to Helsinki. And he notes, with no apparent irony, the New York Times said the timing of this indictment added a jolt of tension to the already freighted atmosphere surrounding Trump's meeting with Putin. It is all but certain to feed into the conspiratorial views held by the president and some of his allies that Mr. Mueller's prosecutors are determined to undermine Trump's designs for a rapprochement with Russia. Now, I don't find that a far-fetched conspiratorial theory. And as I joked earlier, there's a conspiracy here. And it's whether you believe that there was a conspiracy between Russia and the Trump campaign, or if there's been a conspiracy between the intelligence community and the media in this country to limit, hobble, and possibly eject Trump from the White House. And I want to be clear, I wouldn't object to seeing Trump leave the White House, but I don't want an intelligence community-led coup to be the process that produces that. Laria notes that a trial of these 12 suspects is quite unlikely. That makes the indictment essentially a political and not a legal document because it's almost inconceivable that the U.S. government will have to present any evidence in court to back up these charges. And so he also notes that Julian Assange has never been interviewed and that the claims here in the indictment don't offer any details about exactly how WikiLeaks connected with Guccifer 2.0 and DC Leaks. Also at the consortiumnews.com today is a memo from Ray McGovern and Bill Binney. McGovern, former CIA briefer, Binney, former technical director at the NSA, and they recap some of the history of these issues. It's written as a memo to Trump before he attended the meeting with Putin. And one of the notations here is that when we suffered the Vault 7 hack that exposed a lot of cyber tools, weapons used by the U.S. intelligence community, one of them was called Marble Framework, which can hack into computers, obfuscate who hacked, and leave behind incriminating telltale signs that somebody else did it. And that remains a possibility that is not acknowledged by many of those who fully embrace the Russiagate narrative. So I think that this piece is worth reading as well and will raise some questions that deserve good answers. Also, we're learning more about what Bob Mueller believes about Guccifer 2.0, which he says is directly linked to the Russian military intelligence, the GRU. And, of course, we know that over the years, Putin told Trump in a previous meeting that if Russia had done it, they wouldn't have gotten caught because they're professionals. And that is another big question here. Were the Russians so sloppy that they left behind these markers? Now, I know there's communication between Roger Stone, who was an activist for the Trump campaign, kind of in and out of it on an official basis. And I still wait for the real evidence to show us how much of what Robert Mueller stated in the indictments and the narrative that is implied can be proven and what can't. And here's a premature ejaculation. James Risen, Pulitzer Prize-winning former New York Times reporter, now at The Intercept. He has been embracing the Russiagate narrative, and Glenn Greenwald over at The Intercept has largely gone silent about Russiagate. And so Risen goes into a victory lap here with the neener comments. Counsel Mueller drove a particularly sharp nail into the coffin of the conspiracy theory surrounding the cyber attack on the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign in 2016. Spoiler alert, says Risen, the Russians really did do it. It wasn't Seth Rich, he declares, and I don't know what basis he can clear Seth Rich at this point. The murdered young Democratic staffer whose name's been dragged through the mud by countless fringe theorists. It wasn't an inside job by the Democrats themselves, as a group of out-of-touch former intelligence officials tried to convince themselves and the world. He's referring to Ray McGovern and Bill Binney. And he doesn't have evidence, at least he doesn't cite it here. Now, James Risen has a great Rolodex of people who might feed him leaked info and anonymous quotes. But he has no more public information than we do. And he even says here in a qualifier, let me read this. In damning detail, the indictment makes the case that the hack of the Democratic Party was a highly structured, officially sanctioned covert action conducted by Russian intelligence, namely the GRU. Here's the qualifier. If the allegations hold up, there can no longer be any question as to whether the cyber attack was ordered and approved by the Putin government. Well, Jimmy, Your qualified clause that leads that sentence undermines the conclusion that you draw. And this is what passes for journalism in this country today. Let's quote him again. Perhaps the strongest evidence of possible collusion between Trump and Russia, included in the indictment, relates to an odd and inflammatory statement Trump made in the midst of the campaign. And we all heard this. On July 27, 2016, Trump said, "Hey, Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing." And Mueller's indictment includes this juicy tidbit. On or about July 27, 2016, the Russians attempted after hours to spearfish for the first time email accounts at a domain hosted by a third-party provider and used by Clinton's personal office. That would be Hillary's server. So I find this to be both fascinating and infuriating because we are still in the dark about the central evidence required to prove the assertions that are made in the indictment and that are embellished and amplified by so many supporters of the Russiagate narrative. I'm sure some of my listeners are tired of this whole thing. They just want it to go away. Please, can you have impeachment scheduled for next week? And I'm sorry, this is irritating, it's frustrating, but that's where it is and how I see it. I referenced earlier about the so-called Novichok poisonings in Britain, and the British authorities, according to anonymous sources who spoke to the New York Times, claim that the GRU is responsible for the nerve agent attack. On Friday, we reported that the most recent couple who were stricken, and the woman died, her name was Dawn, and his name was Charlie Rowley, that Charlie Rowley's home was investigated, and they found a little bottle that they claim had Novichok in it. Now, once again, Russia denies it stoutly. Russia is in no way involved in this episode. We consider this whole thing a major provocation. That's the official statement. And then, toward the end of this New York Times article, they quote Irek Murtazan, who worked closely with the GRU and now covers military affairs for Novaya Gazeta. He said that when the agencies conduct assassinations, they tend to be unshowy. He would have died from a heart attack or a stroke, a car would have run him over, or a bum would have beat him up. There wouldn't have been any Novichok. Well, let that roll around in your minds just a little bit. Every day I pause to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Great people from all over the U.S. and around the world. Terry Paris, Cheryl Fleming, Dick Atley in Maine, Billy Cook way up in the northern reaches of California. They all kick in a few bucks every month to help support my work. And I need you to do it too. Just visit peterbcollins.com. There's a menu tab. Click on it. Then click on Become a Subscriber. You'll land on the sign-up page. The options are there, $5, $10, $20 a month. With our $50 annual subscription, I'll be happy to send you a copy of John Dist's new rock and roll CD called American University, a theme concept piece based on JFK and his assassination and cover-up. And if you're allergic to PayPal, you can communicate directly with me. My P.O. Box is 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. You got it? 150660, San Rafael, and the zipper is 94915. Couple of stories here about Israel. Over the weekend, mowing the lawn once again in Gaza. They retaliated to some of these ineffective rocket launches and mortar fire that comes from the Gaza Strip, and 2 Palestinian teenagers were killed in an airstrike in Gaza City, while 3 Israelis were wounded from a rocket that landed in a residential home. Now, the New York Times got an exclusive. Well, 2 other media outlets were allowed to take a peek at documents that Israel says they stole from a warehouse in Tehran at the beginning of this year. And they say the documents show how far along Iran was in its nuclear program and that Trump was right in pulling out of the deal because it's a ruse. But the Times freely admits that these documents are 15 years old. The Israelis handpicked the documents shown to reporters. They even acknowledge, meaning that exculpatory material could have been left out. The Iranians, on their part, maintain the entire collection is fraudulent. But even if you put that aside, Israel conducted an intelligence operation that was pretty brazen. And instead of copying the materials and leaving them there, they broke in and just hauled them out of there. But former members of the Obama administration, who negotiated the nuclear deal with Iran, say the archive proves what they had suspected all along, that Iran had advanced fuel capability, warhead designs, and a plan to build them, but they stopped in 2004, and that's backed up by the assessment that was the intelligence report that was conducted in the final years of the Bush administration. One more story from Israel today. It's the ugliest. Netanyahu is supporting a law that would be described as apartheid. It's in the Knesset now, and it would allow for Jewish-only communities in the state of Israel. And the language allows, it authorizes a community composed of people having the same faith and nationality to maintain the exclusive character of that community. The draft would also permit Jewish religious law to be implemented in certain cases and remove Arabic as an official language. Now, trying to rationalize this, Netanyahu said, in the Israeli democracy, and right there I've got to stop and say it's a theocracy, not a democracy, we will continue to protect the rights of both the individual and the group. This is guaranteed. But the majority have rights too, and the majority rules. Now, this has outraged many people, including some leading Zionists, like Israel's Attorney General and President, Reuven Rivlin, said it would harm the Jewish people worldwide, would even be used as a weapon by our enemies. The segregation clause could also allow towns that exclude Jews of Middle East origin, who've been historically sidelined, or gay people. And here's a lefty Israeli writing in Haaretz, Mordecai Kremnitzer from the faculty of Hebrew University Law School, said the bill would remove the mask so as to reveal the ugly face of ultranationalist Israel in all its repugnance. Today, for my subscribers, I'm releasing a fresh interview with Yasha Levine. He's been on this program many times since he was working at Pando. More recently, he published his book, Surveillance Valley, The Secret Military History of the Internet, and in a lengthy piece at The Baffler, which I'm linking to in the show file for the podcast, he makes the case that the Electronic Frontier Foundation is a major advocate for the privacy rights of Americans when those rights are threatened by the U.S. government. But when they are threatened by corporations like Google and Facebook that are collecting massive detailed data on every aspect of our lives, he says EFF is silent. Here is an excerpt from my conversation with Yasha Levine.
Well, yeah, look, this is one of the, I think, ugliest and most indicative episodes in EFF's history. Because in 2004, really, Google was just beginning to pioneer this for-profit surveillance model that now underlies much of the internet. It was beginning to use the data that it was able to gather on its users and to use that data for targeted advertising. So it found that it could increase the efficiency of its advertising, that people clicked on their ads much more readily if they were at least somewhat in line with their interests. And so it began to expand that business model to try to get as much data on people who used Google in the Google platform. And Gmail represented a new step in that business model, because up until that moment, there was no login service for Google, right? So all it could really tell about you, it could put a cookie, it could know generally where you're from, it could try to fingerprint you, who you are, like your identity. But it could only get a general sense because, more than one person usually used the computer. And so it could get like a sense of, where you lived, what your general interests were, what the zip code is, maybe how affluent you were, things like that. But Gmail was offered this whole new dimension because you signed up to Gmail usually with your real name, and you communicated with people. You sent your address, you planned, you received stuff from payment information, bank statements, communications with your doctor, business communications, all these things that are very personal and that are tied directly to your real identity in the world. Gmail gave Google that access. Suddenly, it not only knew generally who you were when you were browsing the internet, but now it knew your identity because you were logging into the Google service. And when people found out that Google was going to finance Gmail and finance this operation by scanning everyone's emails, there was a lot of excitement over it from some quarters, and you read in the New York Times at the time stuff like, that this is revolutionary, that this is going to change everything. But there were others that were concerned, rightly so, that, wait a second, we're allowing this company to just read all our emails, to read our mail? This is not right. And so there was some resistance from some civil liberty groups and privacy groups. EFF was not among them.
I hope you'll check out the full interview with Yasha Levine about the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'll be posting it in an hour or so for all of my subscribers to grab at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher. And I've got more news, but I've run out of time today. It'll be fresh enough. I'll share it with you tomorrow. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling